Good afternoon. Let me welcome you to the first lecture in a series entitled Psychology, Spirituality, and Psychotherapy Toward a Revised Religious Humanism by Professor Don S. Browning, who is the Alexander Campbell Professor of Ethics and the Social Sciences Emeritus at the University of Chicago. I'm Robert Neville, Executive Director of the Danielsen Institute at Boston University, which is sponsoring the lecture series through its Center for the Study of Religion and Psychology. The series is part of a project entitled Religious and Psychological Well-Being, generously funded by the Meta-Nexus Institute of the Templeton Foundation. Professor Browning holds the PhD from the University of Chicago Divinity School, where he has taught almost the whole of his career. His books include Atonement and Psychotherapy, 1966. Generative Man, Society and the Good Man, in Philip Rieff, Norman Brown, Eric Fromm, and Erik Erikson. The Moral Content of Pastoral Care. Pluralism and Personality, William James and Some Contemporary Cultures of Psychology. Religious Ethics and Pastoral Care. Religious Thought and the Modern Psychologies. A Fundamental Practical Theology. Many people here have read that one. Marriage and Modernization, How Globalization Threatens Marriage and How It Must Be Reformed to Meet the Challenge. Christian Ethics and the Moral Psychologies. And Equality and the Family, A Fundamental Practical Theology of Children, Mothers, and Fathers in Modern Societies. And that one is in 2007. With co-authors, he's written From Culture Wars to Common Ground, Religion and the American Family Debate, Reweaving the Social Tapestry Toward a Public Philosophy and Policy of Families, and Christian Marriage and Modern Marriage Law. He's edited with others Marriage, Health, and the Professions, Marriage, Just a Piece of Paper, Sex, Marriage, and Family in World Religions, American Religions and the Family, How Faith Traditions Cope with Modernization and Democracy, The Child in World Religions, and Children and Childhood in American Religions. I list the co-authored and edited books, not that I expect you to remember them all, because they illustrate the fact that Professor Browning is the preeminent pioneer and practitioner of collaborative, multidisciplinary studies of religious issues. Beginning in 1991, he has led the extraordinary collaborative research project on religion, culture, and the family, funded by the Lilly Endowment, whose topic is reflected in the titles of so many of his books. Marriage, Just a Piece of Paper began as a 90-minute PBS video that was widely distributed. Our collaborative, multidisciplinary project on religious and psychological well-being at Boston University carries on Professor Browning's conviction about the importance of collaborative work, including the biological as well as social sciences and many of the humanities. Now, Professor Browning will lecture again this evening at 7:30 in this place on the topic, Broadening Psychology, Refining Theology. Tomorrow, he will give the third lecture in the series, Change and Critique in Psychology, Therapy, and Spirituality, at 7:30, again in this place, room 101 of Sargent College at Boston University, at 635 Commonwealth Avenue. Professor Browning will return on November 16th and 17th to deliver the 3 final lectures in his series. Continuing education units are offered for psychologists and social workers for attendance at each lecture. Now, join me in welcoming Professor Don Browning to give the first of his lectures, Science, Religion, and a Revived Religious Humanism. Thank you.
Well, it's an honor for me to be invited to give these lectures. at Boston University. I've been at Boston University before, but not in this capacity, and it's a delight. I have great respect for Robert Neville, great respect for the endeavor that the center is pursuing, and admiration for what I understand to be the goals of the nucleus of a working group that is pursuing these, many of whom I think in this group are here in the audience today. And they're delighted to see a few extras of you in the audience as well, I believe. You'll hear me champion interdisciplinary work, both of the kind that I've been involved in and the kind that I see emerging at my alma mater at the University of Chicago. And it is obviously emerging many places around the country, as well as Boston University. So thank you for the invitation, and I hope you don't mind that Robert felt compelled to read you the whole list of books, but I think he was trying to make a point, and that is I've dabbled in interdisciplinary work, for good or for ill. For over 150 years, there's been a vital and often contentious dialogue between science and religion. By the way, there is no amplification here. I've got a microphone on, but it has to do with the recording for documentation. If you don't hear me, raise your hand. I'll try to project the best I can. For 150 years, there's been a vital and often contentious dialogue between science and religion. In recent years, new energy and fresh public interest has been injected into the conversation. This largely has come about due to new insights into religion and ethics achieved by the collaboration between evolutionary psychology and cognitive and social neuroscience. What are the likely social consequences of this new interest in the relation of science and religion? There are at least three possible answers. One might be the new atheism, exemplified by the writings of Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens. In this approach, the alleged defective thinking of the world religions is exposed, and a worldview and way of life based strictly on science is offered as replacement. A second option might be the return of a hegemonic dominance of religion over science, and we see efforts to bring that about even today. The third might be the emergence of a revitalized religious humanism of the kind that has happened on several occasions in the past in most of the great world religions. This is the option that I will advocate. What would this religious humanism be like? The major world religions would remain visible and viable as religious movements. But the contributions of science would help these religions refine their interest in improving the health, education, wealth, and overall well-being of their adherents and the general population. In addition, the sciences would help them refine their grasp of the empirical world, about which they, like humans in general, are constantly making judgments, predictions, and characterizations. In my vision, the attitude of scientists toward religion would be, first of all, phenomenological. They would first attempt to describe and understand, in the sense of Verstehen, religious beliefs, ethics, and rituals in their full historical context. But they're interested in explaining some of the conditions that give rise to religious phenomenon would not be inhibited by either religion or the wider society. Yet the wiser scientists would understand the limits of explanation, be hesitant to skip lightly over the initial phenomenological moment, and be reluctant to plunge headlong into speculations about the ultimate truth or falsity of religious ideas and practices in the way exhibited by the new scientific atheism. On the other hand, religions themselves can contribute to the sciences. They can do this by offering new hypotheses about social and religious ideas, behaviors, and rituals, and how they can shape experience, even neural experience and neural processes, often for the good, but sometimes not. The religions can offer a more generous epistemology and ontology than science is inclined to find useful for the tight explanatory interests of the laboratory or scientific survey. This, too, might generate new hypotheses for scientific investigation. These would be some of the ground rules for how the dialogue between science and religion might stimulate a revised religious humanism. To speak of a revival of religious humanism acknowledges that there has been expressions of religious humanism in the past. I will limit myself to speaking about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The synthesis between Greek philosophical psychology and Christianity can be found in the use of Stoic theories of desire by the Apostle Paul, the presence of Aristotle's family ethic in the household codes of New Testament Ephesians and 1 Colossians, and the Gospel of John's identification of Jesus with the Platonic and Stoic idea of the pre-existent Word. A more intentional religious humanism can be found in Augustine's use of the Neoplatonic Plotinus, especially in the philosophical psychology of remembrance in his Confessions. But the most dramatic example of religious humanism that spread simultaneously into Judaism, Christianity, and Islam can be found when the lost texts of Aristotle were rediscovered, translated, and appropriated by scholars from these three religions who worked at the same tables in Islamic libraries in Spain and Sicily during the 9th and 10th century. Richard Rubinstein, in his timely book Aristotle's Children, tells the story well. This gave rise to forms of Aristotelian religious humanism in the works of Thomas Aquinas in Christianity, Maimonides in Judaism, and Alvarez in Islam. On the American scene, one sees another form of Christian humanism in the synthesis of philosophical pragmatism, with all of its influence from Darwin and various expressions of liberal Christianity and the social gospel movement. Religious humanisms have not always flourished and are subject to attacks from both fundamentalism and scientific secularists. They need constant updating and vigorous intellectual development. But at their best, they make it possible for societies to maintain strong religious communities, as well as integrating symbolic umbrellas that protect the productive interaction of scientific and philosophical disciplines with the wider cultural and religious life. But upon what epistemological and ontological grounds could such a dialogue between science and religion proceed today, especially if they were supportive of a revived religious humanism? In these lectures, I will address this question as a Christian theologian. Furthermore, most of my illustrations will come from the Christian tradition. Although I'm interested in the possibility of a more widespread revival of religious humanism in Judaism, Islam, and the other great religions, my illustrations and arguments will feature the tradition I know best. This will be useful for another reason. Of all the great world religions, for a variety of internal and external historical reasons, Christianity has doubtless had the most vigorous encounter to date with the challenges and stimulations of the rise of science in the modern world. In my effort to demonstrate how the dialogue between science and religion can be productive, I will go two directions at once, with varying degrees of evenness. To say it crassly, like the philosophical pragmatist that I actually am, I will try to show the payoff for Christianity on the one hand, and the payoff for selected psychological disciplines on the other. I will attempt to show what Christianity can learn from some aspects of science that will refine. Mark the word refine, it's terribly important, which I have to say today, and even improve our own religious beliefs, ethics, worship, healing, and spiritual practices. But I also will suggest ways in which these scientific disciplines can profit as well. By profit, however, I do not mean just getting more money in the research accounts, although that may happen as well. As I clearly indicated, the modern psychologies, even the properly naturalistic forms, can gain new hypotheses about how external experiences, including religious experiences, shapes internal experiences, feelings, motivations, neural processes, and behaviors. With the advent of positive psychology in the work of Martin Seligman, Jonathan Haidt, Joshua Green, and many others, an entire range of new research topics has emerged in psychology around love, forgiveness, wisdom, virtue, and spiritual transformation that were almost entirely absent from the psychological disciplines as recently as a decade ago. We live in a period of wider and more fruitful epistemologies that open new possibilities for research between science and religion, even psychology and Christian theology, that need not threaten either and could indeed strengthen them both. I've been retired from the Divinity School of the University of Chicago for over 6 years. Since the time of my official departure, several new collaborative research projects involving the natural sciences and the humanities, including theology and religious studies, have emerged around this university, which historically has been dedicated to graduate education and research. There are today collaborative projects involving the natural sciences and the humanities, proceeding on such diverse topics as spirituality and health, a science of virtue, wisdom, decision-making, and the role of anthropomorphism in human thinking in general and in religion. These involve social neuroscientists, philosophers, political theorists, medical doctors, social psychologists, sociologists, and theologians. Such collaboration at this school would have been unthinkable during the peak of my active teaching years. It is interesting to note that the stimulators of much of this collaboration comes from the burgeoning field of social neuroscience and such innovative and ecumenical scholars as John Cacioppo and Howard Nussbaum. Their knowledge of the neuroplasticity of the human brain leads them to be as interested in how the external influences of social, cultural, and religious experience shape the physical base of our mental processes as they are in how these brain processes project themselves into our thoughts and behavior. I recall a prediction made to me by a distinguished New York University psychologist in the early 1990s. He believed that the rise of the neurosciences would relegate most of traditional psychology to the humanities, and the developments of psychology would become branches. Departments of psychology would become branches of biology and medicine. I can remember leaving his office in a slight fog of depression, overhearing this possibility. In many places, however, just the reverse has happened. A new conversation between psychology and the humanities has arisen that may have immense fruitfulness for both fields of study. But what epistemological and ontological framework should guide such a conversation and possible collaboration? By the way, if you're leaving and coming back, I know who you are, could you bring a glass of water?
Yeah, that's what I'm doing.
You're good. There's a highly intuitive person there. She saw it coming. I shouldn't have get up here without a glass of water. There's a flat desk up here that will hold the glass of water, and I overlooked it. But what epistemological and ontological framework should guide such a conversation and possible collaboration? I will propose in these lectures the resources of what the late French philosopher Paul Ricoeur would call either critical hermeneutics or hermeneutic phenomenology. I can imagine that the very sound of these technical terms sends icy chills down the spines of some of my audience, but I will try to explain these terms, the best I can as I develop my arguments. I can say this much now. There has been in recent years important and powerful proposals about the importance of phenomenology for the psychological disciplines, even the clinical disciplines. They have been advanced by Frank Richardson, Blaine Fowers, and Charles Gagnon in re-envisioning psychology, and Paul Cushman in Constructing the Self, Constructing America, Cultural History of Psychotherapy. But from my perspective, these two proposals move too far in the direction of making psychology a thoroughly interpretive discipline, nearly losing the element of objectivity, or what I will call, following Ricoeur, the moments of distantiation and explanation that psychology as science must always include. When I say these things now to chart the course that I will travel, I will say more about these cryptic remarks in a moment. I first start, however, with the phrase hermeneutic phenomenology. Hermeneutic phenomenology is an offshoot of European hermeneutic and philosophical movements. The hermeneutics side ran through the work of the German theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher, the historian Wilhelm Dilthey, and the philosophers Martin Heidegger, Hans-Georg Gadamer, and Paul Ricoeur. This movement was concerned with the question about the appropriate interpretation of texts. It held that the quest for meaning by the human spirit were objectified in the great texts of the past, and that to retain this fund of meaning and insight, these texts required interpretation and internalization. The hermeneutic movement gave rise to the disciplines, the hermeneutic movement arose from the disciplines of history, literary studies, philosophy, and theology as part of the Geisteswissenschaften, the cultural or moral sciences, in contrast to the Naturwissenschaften, the natural sciences. The hermeneutic movement was particularly concerned to resist what they called and what it called the naturalization of the mind, the modeling of the mind after the objectifying sciences of the neurobiology and physiology and physics of that time. To say it bluntly, the hermeneutic movement was a strategy in the humanities to counter what my New York University psychologist friend thought was certain to happen when he made his prediction in the early 1990s about the influence of the turn of psychology to the neurosciences. The hermeneutic movement had an interest in description, but primarily the description of meaning housed in the great literary classics that were formative in shaping Western civilization. Phenomenology, in a more rigorous sense of the term, began with the late 19th century German philosopher Edmund Husserl. Husserl, however, advocated a kind of transcendental phenomenology that pursued a stringent description of the objects of consciousness, when both the presuppositions of the existence of the personal ego and assumptions about the existence of objects in the external world were bracketed, suspended, and set aside. Hermeneutic phenomenology is different from Husserl's transcendental reduction of both the existence of the objects of description as well as the existence of the perceiving and describing personal ego. Hermeneutic phenomenology should even be distinguished from William James's kind of phenomenological psychology, which allowed the personal ego and its unique experience as legitimate subject matter for phenomenological description. It's interesting to note that in the history of the rise of phenomenology, James influenced Husserl in ways Husserl did not influence James. In fact, James one time advocated not publishing one of Husserl's books in the United States, even though the book was discussing some of James's ideas. Husserl was too influenced by Descartes for my taste. He, like Descartes, founded epistemology on the pure ego that had been stripped of its linguistic and historical constitution. Early in his career, Ricoeur had published profound, transcendental phenomenological studies of the essence of willing in his book titled Voluntary and Involuntary, and the fallibility of the will in his book titled Fallible Man. But when Ricoeur decided he wanted to study the actual experience of fault in contrast to the sheer possibility of fault, he turned to hermeneutic phenomenology and studied the epigenetic history of Western symbols and myths of fault and evil in his monumental symbolism of evil. Presupposition of this turn from pure phenomenology to hermeneutic phenomenology was a conviction that from the beginning, the ego could not be the pure ego of Descartes and Husserl. It was instead both an embodied ego located in a desiring body and an ego constellated by language, tradition, and symbols from our inherited cultural past. We are feeling and desiring creatures who project our feelings through linguistic metaphors and symbols. This is great. Thank you so much. This is why Ricoeur, as do metaphor and cognitive theorists George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, believes that philosophy should anchor itself in the deep avowals and confessions of human consciousness that express themselves in metaphors and symbols. As Ricoeur said one place, the symbol gives rise to thought. By this he means that philosophy, and by implication psychology, studies of human consciousness and unconsciousness that are mixtures of desire, constellated, however vaguely, by the great metaphorical and symbolic resources that have formed a cultural tradition. If this is true, there's hardly any way that either philosophy or psychology can avoid the subjects of spirituality and religion. These symbols and narratives from our various cultural traditions already have shaped the minds of both the psychological investigators and the people they study and try to heal. So Ricoeur's hermeneutic phenomenology does not start in describing pure consciousness, as does Husserl, but in describing the embodied consciousness shaped by the metaphors, symbols, myths, and narratives mediated by interpersonal, social, and cultural traditions. But before we review how he brings into his hermeneutics description the distantiating and explanatory interest of the natural sciences, we need to learn a bit more about how hermeneutic phenomenology works. There are four core ideas in hermeneutic phenomenology. The first is Gadamer's important theory of effective history, a concept that Ricoeur freely advocates. This idea points to the situated character of all thinking and investigation. Historical texts, events, and monuments are not simply things that linger in the past, that have no effect on us today. The past is mediated to us today through a variety of sources and shapes us in myriads of ways that we often cannot name or easily bring to consciousness. Second, this effective history shapes what Gadamer calls our pre-understandings. These pre-understandings are the inherited frameworks that we rely on in attempting to understand our experience of the world, especially that which already has shaped us. We would not understand our everyday experience if we did not have this fund of interpretive frameworks accumulated through repeated successful understandings of past generations. From one perspective, these pre-understandings function like prejudices. But from another perspective, they are comparative references that make sense of our experiences. They may need to be tested, and, as I will argue, both science and religion can play a very important role in testing some of these pre-understandings of our inherited cultural, spiritual, and religious traditions. But these pre-understandings from our affective histories should not be denied and suppressed, as more positivistic philosophy and science are inclined to do. They serve a purpose, and they cannot be tested if they are not interpreted and understood. Such testing and interpretation is part of the task of a religious humanism, and as I will argue, both philosophy and various psychologies can contribute much to this testing process. The third concept is about the most basic character of human understanding. From the perspective of hermeneutic phenomenology, all understanding is like a dialogue or conversation. In fact, understanding is a dialogue and conversation. It is an ontological feature of human consciousness that our consciousness is fundamentally dialogic and conversational. Understanding anything, be it an event today or in the past, a behavior, a conversation, a therapeutic exchange, a spiritual exercise, or a religious ritual, is first of all a matter of dialogue. This may sound trivial, but the point is really profound, especially when making this assertion to scientists. It is asserting, in effect, understanding something is not first and not fundamentally an objective process. This claim is often difficult for scientists to comprehend, but this is precisely what the Richardson team and Philip Cushman are contending in their respective books interpreting the entire range of psychology and psychotherapy as hermeneutic disciplines. The fourth concept is closely associated with the idea of understanding as dialogue. It makes an important tie between understanding as dialogue and the nature of moral thinking. Gadamer and Ricoeur believe that moral interests shape the understanding process from the beginning. This means that we do not first determine the objective nature of experience and the world and then figure out how to apply this objective knowledge to concrete situations of moral action, even when these situations take the form of therapeutic interventions or care. Gadamer says it well when he writes, "We too determined that application, meaning the application of something to a practical action, is neither a subsequent nor merely occasional part of the phenomenon of understanding, but co-determines it as a whole from the beginning." By using the word application in this passage, Gadamer means practical moral application. This is my favorite passage from Gadamer. It asserts that there is an unbreakable tie between understanding and practical moral reason. Understanding can never be totally neutral or objective. Our practical interests and pre-understandings will always enter the picture to some degree, shaping understanding from the very beginning. I can imagine by now that many of you are becoming nervous. There's some science about objectivity, explanation of causes, controlled observations, and if possible, experimentation so that variables can be controlled and manipulated. And, of course, the answer must be yes. These are legitimate interests of science and make science what it is. This leads me to advocate not only hermeneutic phenomenology as a beginning point for both philosophy and psychology, but a particular version of this point of view called critical hermeneutics and hermeneutic realism. This view is also associated with the hermeneutic philosophy of Paul Ricoeur, in contrast to the hermeneutics of Gadamer and his teacher, Martin Heidegger. Critical hermeneutics finds a place for explanation and a kind of epistemological distance that we mistakenly call objectivity. In other words, Ricoeur's view of hermeneutics finds a place for what we call science. For him and for me, the explanatory and distancing objectives of science do not stand, though, however, on their own foundation. They evolve out of a prior understanding of the affective history that shapes all of us, and then returns to that history with refinements and adjustments to the massive funds of wisdom and insight which tradition delivers to us from the tested and sometimes not so tested experiences of the past. Ricoeur is actually critical of Gadamer for his neglect of science and his dialogical view of human understanding. In Ricoeur's books titled Hermeneutics and the Human Sciences, he suggests that the very title of Gadamer's magnum opus reflects a neglect of science. He writes, "The question is to what extent the work deserves to be called truth and method." You may recall that's the title of Gadamer's great book. And whether it ought not instead to be titled truth or method. By the word method, Ricoeur is referring to Gadamer's neglect of the role of distantiation and causal explanation in the larger framework of understanding. Gadamer, Ricoeur explains, was so concerned with what he called alienating distantiation, Verfremdung, and its influence on disconnecting modern consciousness from tradition, that he unfortunately neglected science and explanation altogether. Gadamer's concern has been transmitted to Frank Richardson and his team, who see the alienation of modern consciousness from tradition, wrought in part by scientific psychology and psychotherapy, as resulting in a kind of ontological individualism that gives primacy to the individual's self-fulfillment, disassociated from the wisdom and claims of tradition. On account of this neglect of science in a hermeneutic model of human understanding, Ricoeur proposes substituting the concepts of distantiation and diagnosis for the concept of objectivity. To illustrate the meaning of these concepts, one can turn to the way a medical doctor or even a psychotherapist might use the more scientific diagnostic tools of her profession. In medicine, the blood pressure monitor, stethoscope, X-ray machine, CAT scan, or in psychology, the DSM-4, TAT, Rorschach test, any number of pencil and paper tests, or even PET, SPECT, or the fMRI. The use of such instruments for diagnostic purposes generally will be preceded by an interview, indeed, a conversation about how the subject feels, thinks he feels, thinks is right or wrong with his functioning, work life, marital life, or friendship. According to Ricoeur, what the physician and psychologist learn from the objective instruments gains its meaning significantly with reference to the embodied subjectivity, lived experience, and encoded affective history of the patient or client. With this illustration in mind, we can comprehend how to envision explanation as not pure objectivity without presuppositions, but degrees of distantiation, which makes sense only in relation to describing a more basic foreground of social and historical experience, belonging and embeddedness. Hence, rather than celebrating either extreme, the pretensions of objective science, or Gadamer's uncritical embeddedness in tradition, Ricoeur asks, would it not be appropriate to reformulate the question in such a way that a certain dialectic between experience of belonging, by that he means belonging to tradition, and alienating distantiation becomes the mainspring, the key to the inner life of hermeneutics. Hence, for Ricoeur, truth, which he identifies with hermeneutic understanding of the affective history that has formed us, and scientific method and explanations are not viewed, as they are for Gadamer, as a matter of either or. Rather, he sees truth and scientific method as a dialectical process. I must point out, however, that it is precisely the act of including explanation as a sub-moment of understanding that turns hermeneutic phenomenology into critical hermeneutics of the kind that I'm advocating in these lectures. In this model, the task of explanation is important, and in some instances can contribute refinement and critique to the great fund of wisdom, as we will see in Lecture 2 and throughout my later arguments. This is the epistemology that I believe should guide the dialogue between science and religion, especially the dialogue between religion and the psychological scientific disciplines. This is the model that will bear the most fruit in studying human consciousness, its preconscious or unconscious depths, forms of healing and psychotherapy, the analogs between psychotherapy and spirituality, or the processes of moral and spiritual development. This is also the model that I recommended for reviving both religious humanism in general and Christian humanism in particular. An epistemology that gives priority to understanding over explanation needs one to take the effective history of the past with the utmost seriousness. It provides models of consciousness, prototypes of intervention, and traditions of confession, restoration, and healing, which the modern disciplines may be able to refine, but probably not completely invent. Science will move more firmly and successfully into the future if it keeps in touch with the past. I have confessed already that I will illustrate many of my arguments with the tradition I know best, the Christian tradition. But this is not just a confession of my own limitations, although it certainly is that, but a strategy that a critical hermeneutic phenomenology itself also demands. Because of the massive influence of Christianity on the institutions, cultures, and effective history of the West, this tradition, in its interaction and absorption of elements of Judaism, elements of Greek philosophy, and elements of Roman and German law, constitutes an important part of the effective history and consciousness of vast numbers of people, even those who do not profess this religion or any religion at all. The dialogue between science and religion, or between religion and the psychological disciplines, should not neglect this tradition of understanding. This message is especially relevant for the new movement of positive psychology. Of all the movements in psychology today, it has turned to a vital dialogue with the traditions of the past for inspiration, new hypotheses, and the possible refinements that science can offer. One can see this trend in Jonathan Haidt's well-received The Happiness Hypothesis, Finding Modern Truth and Ancient Wisdom. Throughout this engaging summary of the many advances in positive psychology, Haidt is constantly referring to the treasures of the great religious and philosophical traditions of the past, especially Buddhism, because of its sophisticated philosophical psychology. The philosophically literate philosopher Owen Flanagan, although not a positive psychology as such, uses the fruits of that field extensively in his recent Templeton lectures titled The Really Hard Problem, Meaning in a Material World. He, like Haidt, in his appropriation of insights of the past, skips rapidly from the eudaimonism of Aristotle, which he likes, to the interpretation of the emphasis upon mindfulness, non-suffering, and human flourishing, or eudaimonism, found in the texts of Buddha and some of his philosophical followers. In the process, it's fine to turn to Buddhism, but at the same time, Flanagan fails to trace the mixture of Aristotelian eudaimonism and Christianity that developed in the philosophical psychology of Thomas Aquinas, his followers, much of the Protestant Reformation, and the great tradition of Roman Catholic social teachings that has had so much influence on the human rights movements of the modern world. My point is that in reviving the tradition of religious humanism through a dialogue between science and religion, and between religion and psychology, we must not neglect the effective history of the West. At least some of us should be permitted to start in our own backyards. And if we do that, we will gain even more and firmer insights, and then gradually expand our dialogue to include the rest of the world. Thank you very much. Look forward to a little chatting with you.
Thank you for a wonderful opening lecture.
Thank you.
We have time for some discussion. As was noted before, the microphone does not come through the house PA system. It is very important, however, for our tape of the event. So if you have a question, I ask that you please wait until the microphone is actually in your hand before speaking.
I'm just going to kick off the questions to give you guys a chance to think, okay? Thank you for that wonderful lecture. You know, the prospect of a revived religious humanism is really pretty wonderful. And I'm wondering if you think that there would be, or what can you tell me of what's ongoing with the attempt of getting religion working towards the pressing problems that humans are faced today. Things like care of the planet would be one, or I mean, I'm sure you got my point, and maybe you can just add on with your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, first of all, you have to realize that the social gospel movement in the United States was a form of religious humanism. The entire massive network of Catholic hospitals and social institutions, Jewish social institutions, many of which are serving people in general, are expressions of religious humanism. But with regard to the specific topic of the Green movement, religion is a little slow on that in reclaiming its resources. It began to look, you know, back in the 70s and 80s, when environmental concerns became more vital, to its own resources. Stewardship of the earth is a theme that you can find in the Old Testament and repeats itself time and time again. But there was a tendency, I think, in certainly American Protestantism, and maybe in other religions as well, to protect religion from what they consider to be the assaults of science by a pretty drastic separation between human consciousness and nature. It had strong Kantian influences, so there was a time, even I think in the 60s and 70s and 80s, after the heyday of American pragmatism and its influence on religion, which did not separate itself from nature, to kind of say, well, we'll handle Darwinism, we'll handle these things by saying there's a sharp distinction between moral realities, freedom of the will, and the determinism of nature. And in the process, they kind of lost concern with nature and the ecological movement. But I think beginning in the 80s and the 90s, various expressions of religion began to retrieve that. And the various forms of liberal Protestantism began to, and we now know that even strong movements within evangelical Christianity, not all aspects of evangelical Christianity, but a certain important leadership group is trying to get very involved in that, by environmental concerns. And will probably bring the energy and vitality of evangelicalism to that subject when it does. Now, they'd be hesitant to talk about religious humanism like I am. Evangelicals would be. Catholics, for the most part, wouldn't be, depending upon which part of Catholicism you're talking about. The older, pragmatically influenced American Protestantism would not be hesitant to talk about religious humanism. I do think my colleague, William Schweiker at the University of Chicago, is writing books on religious humanism. We have luncheon engagements all the time and chat about that. I see quite a little bit of evidence to retrieve the term and try to explain what it is and what it could be and the various manifestations of it in the past. So there's some hope.
Could you give a very simple, straightforward, I don't know if definition is the word I want, of religious humanism?
Well, religious humanism, I think I'd have to say two dimensions. Not only does it look at religion from the standpoint of what religion does for the flourishing of human beings in this world, as well as what it may do to deliver human beings from the ambiguities and turmoil of this world to some kind of higher existence. It has a strong inner worldly, this worldly dimension, even though this worldly concern would not exhaust its total message. Secondly, it probably is going to be in dialogue with some form of philosophy, philosophical psychology, etc. It helps it gain more specificity to finite natural realities which are important for human flourishing in this world. And we overlook the strong conversation beginning with those movements when Aristotle became so important for Christianity and for parts of Judaism and parts of Islam, certainly not every part. Everybody had to read Aristotle. Everybody had to know Greek. Everybody had to know the treasures of the past to be a respectable religious intellectual. And you go back and you read these. This is true with even Luther and Calvin. These people were highly knowledgeable about the classics of the ancient world outside of Christianity, and they understood the interaction that was going on between Christianity and the Greek and the Roman world, and between Judaism and the Greek and the Roman world. Judaism, the emergence of Christianity, occurred in the context of Roman Hellenism. Gregory the Great had conquered that part of the world 300 years before Jesus. All civic life was shaped by Roman control on the one hand and Greek public policy and civil law on the other hand. So every Christian was living in a Greek world. And you have to read everything in the New Testament as spinning off of and making commentary to, strong assumptive perspectives that come from the influence of Greek and Roman civilization on early Christianity. And if you've got Jewish resources at the same time, you'd undoubtedly see much the same thing. So that's what I mean by, just to summarize it, got a little wordy there, that it has a strong interworldly understanding, but it's not exhausted by the interworldly understandings. And it's probably in dialogue with philosophical and maybe philosophical psychological resources that firm up and give it more specificity to the way it talks about natural processes.
One follow-up, positive psychology. What are the philosophical underpinnings of positive psychology?
I don't know if I can answer that question. I wish there were a positive psychologist in the crowd. I'd ask that question myself. I think there's some confusion there, to be quite frank. You can see it in the subtitle of Haidt's book, how modern knowledge, I think it has to do with, appreciates ancient wisdom or restores ancient wisdom. In spite of getting good ideas for the work of psychology from ancient traditions of wisdom and virtue and so on like that, there is still a sense that we're going to move from modern knowledge back to tweaking these traditions, and I'll try to illustrate that. I think they need something like the perspective that I'm offering. I think they need a critical hermeneutical framework which understands the priority of understanding in human knowledge and the important but relative objectivity of the social sciences. That may be implicit in what they're doing. I don't think it's sufficiently explicit. Anybody who's a positive psychologist in the audience and knows this tradition better than I do? Yeah.
Well, let me just add one part. I think that my understanding, I'm just an ordinary old psychologist, so I do read things like Martin Seligman and so on. And my understanding is that Seligman in particular didn't have anything more than just psychology's been studying languishing too long. Psychology has been focusing too much on depression and disorder, and it's time to take all the tools that psychologists have refined over the last decades and just put them to this question of human flourishing.
Yeah.
So I see a gentleman shaking his head here. Do you want to add anything to that? Sorry, you? Okay.
I'm trying to think about how to formulate this. I'm a psychologist,
Okay.
and I spend a lot of my time training therapists how to do therapy. And one of the things I've noticed is that when we try to objectify, coming from a scientific place, we interrupt the dialogic, or the multilogic if you're working with families or groups.
Yeah.
And we leave the context of not only the client's world of experience, but we leave our own context in an attempt to, if you use the DSM-4, for example, which is a diagnostic and statistical model, a manual for diagnosing. It's like a cookbook for trying to, or an algorithm for trying to diagnose. And it's, in a sense, it's objectifying. I think it's useful as a basis of informing and orienting our knowledge. But if we forget that we are as prone as our clients to our subjective experience driving our work and our formulations, we stand a real danger. So, and that's what I found very useful in what you were saying. It gave support to my thinking about it in that way.
Certainly, Ricoeur's, he wrote the great book Freud and Philosophy, and he did that after he decided to take the turn from pure phenomenology to hermeneutic phenomenology, partially to try to place the role of naturalistic explanation, which he saw Freud trying to do to some extent, within the broader framework of understanding and therapy as dialogue and the exchange of meanings. And but he is always, I think he's very clever in seeing the relationship between explanation and diagnosis. I just had a kind of a super major operation earlier in the summer, and I was struck by the fact that they had all kinds of data on me. They always asked me when they walked in. All the big teams asked me, how are you feeling? What's going on with your life? They wanted to know what my subjective experience of this phenomenon was. And if they were really good, well, you know, they would kind of acknowledge that we're part of this. We're in here. We're in this with you, and we're telling you what we can do and what we can't do, and we're admitting our strengths and weaknesses. And they were often very good about that. And then they would turn to the more objective stuff. I kept on saying, you know how I'm doing. You got the data. You've just got through taking my blood. You know everything. Why are you asking me this question? The question was not gratuitous. The question is a part of their practice. They want to know something about my ongoing subjective experience. And then they think about what their data also means. Not that it can't be pretty illuminating. You're feeling well, but you're really sick, buddy. I just found it really striking that all the data that they have on me, and if anybody's here as a doctor, you know how that accumulates. They would ask that question, and they meant it. They didn't. It wasn't gratuitous. And so I tend to think that your experience about both the usefulness and the cumbersomeness of the DSM-4, is that what we're using now? I always lose track. And is, I think, right on. And I'll say some things in the lecture tonight which are informed by standard psychotherapeutic models as well as things that are coming out of the social neurosciences about the embodied nature and the simulation theory, mirror theory, and the way that's informing what we used to talk about, with regard to experiencing or organismic experiencing in the therapeutic situation. You break that exchange into some emotional and cognitive basis in therapy, and you've lost something. That's what I would imagine.
Let me add one other thing. I sometimes tell students that our work is finished when the client has a diagnosis himself.
Yeah.
And our work is to support them to come to that.
Yeah.
And as I listen to you, I'm thinking it's helping them, the client, to make meaning and give a kind of structure to their experience that brings a certain, not objectivity, but a subjective distance that allows them to begin to see and understand and make meaning out of their experience in ways that can help and inform their ongoing decision-making process and way of living.
My somewhat outdated knowledge of psychotherapy, I used to know much about what was going on. I did a little bit of brushing up for these lectures. Would say that there are probably a lot of that agree with you on that.
Question just to make sure I'm on the right track in understanding your thesis. So if I said that one of the purposes of hermeneutic phenomenology is to...
I think I just a little louder.
Sorry. So if I said that one of the purposes of hermeneutic phenomenology is to, one, for us to recognize perhaps our state of ontological individualization and learn to deal with perhaps the fact that we live under the belief that we are blank slates, that we do not...
What?
Blank slates.
Yeah.
And so hermeneutic phenomenology would be attempting to perhaps close the objectivist gap.
It places the objectivist gap in the context of a larger process of human understanding. My form, the form of critical hermeneutics or critical hermeneutic phenomenology that I try to outline with the resources of Ricoeur, doesn't want to get rid of some of the accomplishments that we talked about under the rubric of objectivity. It just lays it out in another context. It's a move away from so-called foundationalism. Many of you will understand the ongoing philosophical discussion between foundationalism and anti-foundationalism. Does knowledge proceed by wiping your mind completely free of the past, the way you've been shaped, your pre-understandings, and go from objectivity? And once we get everything all straightened out with regard to objectivity, we'll gradually be able to climb back to understanding how to shape our social institutions, our morality, one thing after another. Well, that particular positivist and foundationalist perspective, i.e. moving from sheer objectivity back to the social world, has been under severe philosophical critique, and Ricoeur is part of that. But he doesn't go so far as to try to get rid of objectivity. He just simply says it is a moment, a highly important moment within this larger conversational understanding where you as a creature full of historical shaping try to figure out what's going on, and you need to have a little distance in a variety of ways to do that.
How optimistic are you that your friends in the neurosciences are going to be receptive to this critical hermeneutics?
I have a few acquaintances in that crowd. I'm projecting what I see in people like John Cacioppo and Howard Nussbaum, even to some extent John Dissetti, you'll hear me talking about. I've been sucked into that crowd in retirement. I won't try to explain how it's happened, but it's been one of the nicest things that's happened to me in retirement, because they're really interested in interdisciplinarity, and the old Religion, Culture, and Family Project got me a little reputation around the university of being sympathetic to that. I think they're there. I've certainly said, well, it seems to me on the basis of what I know, when I first met them about a year and a half ago, I said, well, I understand what you guys are doing. Damasio is an example of this, and he's as interested in the way social, cultural, historical experience shapes neural processes as he is the other way around. I assume you are too. And they said, yeah. And so I think we'd have a discussion about it. But I don't have a big list of 30 or 40 social neuroscientists that I know well, but I'm getting to know them. And there are about 6 Templeton projects at the University of Chicago right now, organized under a rubric called Arete, and under the division brought straight into the under the vice president for research. And I just got a memorandum on email about 4 days ago, where he was touting interdisciplinary work as a major interest of the university, and touting the work of Arete and stimulating that. Well, Cacioppo and Nussbaum, as social neuroscience, they got that all going. I found that I would go over and tell my friends in the Divinity School, hey, you're getting scooped. You don't know what's happening over here in another part of the university that's opening up a grand dialogue between humanities and the natural sciences. These guys are natural scientists. I mean, they do all the things that natural sciences do. But they also pick up some very interesting ideas and hypotheses that come from other places. They're kind of like positive psychologists, although they would never call themselves that. So the crowd that I know, I think, would be open to it, but I don't know everybody. I know that they're the hard neuroscientists who would get close to what you would call determinism. But they happen not to be my closer friends for whatever reason.
Someone here and then
Thank you.
I myself am not a Gadamerarian, but I have friends who are, and they would regard Ricoeur's interpretation of Gadamer as so seriously flawed as to be simply untenable. First of all, Gadamer has page after page on what he calls temporal distance. In a section of Truth and Method, the concept of experience and the essence of the hermeneutical experience, he says, modern science thus simply carries through in its methodology what experience has always striven after. Experience is valid only if it is confirmed. Hence, its dignity depends on its fundamental repeatability. Thus, it is not just a chance one-sided emphasis of modern scientific theory, but has a foundation in fact that the theory of experience is related teleologically to the truth that is derived from it. But that aside,
well, actually,
and I am not.
I'm
sorry.
What you're pointing out here is at least worth a good footnote and maybe more in discussing Gadamer, because that is illuminating, and I don't. So I guess the conclusion was they agree more than Ricoeur thought. He was overemphasizing a difference that may be exaggerated, and that maybe some of the opening.
That's being very generous. I think the Gadamerians would say Ricoeur is wrong.
If Ricoeur did what?
Wrong.
Wrong in his interpretation, or wrong in trying to achieve a role for science?
Wrong in his interpretation of Gadamer.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I'm not going to try to defend that, but it sounds like in the end, both of them would find a place for science in ways which I have overlooked and the Ricoeur failed to acknowledge.
What's more concerning to me, frankly, is how does William James play a supplement? You call it in your précis of your talk, supplemented by James. And I'm interested in how you see James's pragmatism and phenomenology contributing to this.
Well, I'll say a little bit about that. I don't know whether it's lecture 3 or lecture 4 on spirituality. I think, and I would push Ricoeur in the direction of James in finding what I'd call a subordinate place for functionalism within a context of a wider understanding of understanding as dialogue and a wider understanding of the importance of phenomenology. But you look through the varieties and both conceptually and in terms of what he's actually doing, James, I think, starts with the way in which people are experiencing their religion or their religious experience, and he's describing that pretty thickly. Now, he's describing not the pure ego, but the empirical personal ego, and so you'd call it a form of phenomenological psychology, and I think Husserl, as I understand, would never have used that phrase. But then, when it comes to evaluating it, he brings them in the role of fruits. And fruits, what's it doing for the person's life? It's another way of talking about human flourishing. And there you hear tones of functionalism and evidence of his appreciation for adaptation, even some Darwinistic ideas. And so that dialectic, he's interested, that dialectic between the descriptive and the functional, I think, is in James, and I would push Ricoeur a bit in that direction more than you often see.
Well,
am I addressing your question?
Indeed, but precisely so, in that I think you dispatch Husserl far too quickly.
I'll accept that.
I think that James could not be as interesting to us as a phenomenologist if he didn't, in fact, provide Husserl with a certain kind of inspiration for the very concept of a Lebenswelt, of a lived world.
Oh, yeah, no, Husserl picked up the idea of fringe, of consciousness, Lebenswelt. All these are implicit in James. But when James, some publisher, I wrote a book that was half on James one time, William James and contemporary cultures of psychology. And I was into Lynn Scholten and all the people that were writing in the 60s and 70s and discovering the phenomenological dimensions of James and the influence of James on European phenomenology. But the funny thing was, some of those people like Husserl could cotton on to some of James's concepts, probably dropping his functionalism, you know, not paying too much attention to that. But when James saw it come back across the Atlantic, and publishers would send Husserl's books to him to say, should we publish this? He'd say no. And my hunch is that the descriptions of the pure ego in contrast to the personal ego was what put him off. But yeah, Husserl picked up a lot of James.
We have time for one more? There was somebody who wasn't you. Okay, well, I guess I'll see. Forget it.
Your project of, in part, finding a place for objective data, objective information in a wider interpretive framework of human flourishing, I endorse that. I think that's a wonderful project. But in my own attempts to do this, I constantly find problems arising when the objective data coming in about a human person or a situation or an interpretation stands in pretty stark contradiction to or tension with a person's self-understanding derived from other domains. A classic example would be Jonathan Haidt's work, for example.
Yeah.
You see him able to have a conversation with someone about their moral reasoning and then notice through experimental procedures how much the narratives they attach to their moral reasoning are in fact ad hoc constructions to justify a moral instinct that's prior to their moral reasoning. And the fact that they don't notice that is something that objective science can present to them. You can enter that into a conversation, and then his experimental subjects will point blank deny over and over and over again that they're actually trying to rationalize with their moral reasoning a pre-existing moral judgment. That's one example, but there are thousands of examples where encounters with objective information stand in tension with a wider interpretive framework of human life. And I'd love to hear you say something about how you're supposed to reconcile these things, because it seems like the hermeneutical process actually needs reform.
I will say some things, and that does point to one of the roles I think that science can play, that's a critical role with regard to these traditions. But I think we'd both agree, and my understanding, that neither Haidt nor Joshua Green will completely disband the role of deliberation. They just say it's pretty anemic.
That's correct.
But I think that's what we would challenge them to do, is to fill that out a little bit more with additional reflections. And you'll hear me refer to Kwame Appiah, the philosopher at Princeton who's written this book, Experiments in Ethics, who's very appreciative of the scientific investigation of moral philosophy and moral issues. So, well, really, basically what people like Haidt and Green have done when they don't completely eliminate deliberation is to open up the importance of institutions as backgrounds to deliberation, as fortifications to deliberation, and all of the history and shaping that goes into this. And after all, Haidt is a political liberal, and he does not want us to live by our moral intuitions alone. Well, he's got something to explain there. How does he get there? And so I'm not challenging his insights that we're very instinctive in our judgments and in ways which we don't fully understand and will fail to realize the collision. I'm just saying the discussion's not over yet. There's more, if they keep that door open and there's a big door to do a lot more investigation on. That would be my perspective on that.
Well, perhaps we should stop at this point and make sure that both our lecturer and audience can get a good dinner and a good rest, and hopefully many of you will have had your appetite whetted and come back for more this evening and tomorrow night. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.